Elizabeth Cady Stanton's memoir, 80 Years and More, isn't just a list of dates or a collection of political victories. It is a sweeping, deeply personal account of a life spent trying to dismantle the very foundations of how society viewed women. When she began writing these reminiscences, she was an elder stateswoman of a movement she helped create, looking back on a journey that started in the quiet, intellectual landscape of upstate New York in 1815 and ended on the global stage. To understand the woman who would eventually challenge the Bible itself, you have to understand the world she was raised in. She grew up at the Peterboro estate, a place defined by a very specific kind of radicalism. Her father, Daniel Cady, was a prominent judge, a man of dignified reserve who lived by a strict sense of law and order. Her mother, Margaret Livingston, was a woman of much more military character, strong, self-reliant, and perhaps the person who most directly shaped Elizabeth's independent spirit. The atmosphere at home was one of intellectual freedom, thanks in large part to their neighbour and friend, Gerrit Smith, a well-known radical reformer. In that house, the ideas of abolition and social justice weren't just abstract concepts, they were the air people breathed. But for young Elizabeth, there was a specific, driving motivation to prove her worth. The death of her brother in her youth left a mark on her, creating a sense that she had to work twice as hard to claim her place in a world that seemed designed for men. She mastered Greek and Latin, pushing against the systemic exclusion that kept women from higher education, and she did so while watching the legal vulnerabilities of women in her father's own law office. She saw firsthand how the law treated women not as individuals, but as extensions of their fathers or husbands. As she moved into adulthood, her life was defined by a series of awakenings. There was a period of religious skepticism that would eventually lead her to her most controversial work, and there was a notable scandal involving a classmate's plagiarism trick that showed her early, sharp-witted nature. But perhaps the most telling moment of her early life was her marriage to Henry Stanton. In an era where marriage was a legal absorption of a woman's identity, Elizabeth and Henry made a radical pact. They refused to use the word obey in their wedding vows. This wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a political statement that would serve as the blueprint for her entire life. She wasn't looking for a master, she was looking for a partner. Her early activism was deeply intertwined with the abolitionist movement. She traveled to Europe, witnessing the crushing poverty in Ireland and the grand, almost surreal spectacle of Napoleon's remains in Paris. These travels broadened her perspective, helping her see that the struggle for the rights of one group was inextricably linked to the struggles of all marginalized people. When she returned to the United States and settled in Seneca Falls, she entered a phase of life that many of her contemporaries found most difficult to navigate, the domestic sphere. She was a mother and a wife, managing a large, demanding household. She spoke often of a mental hunger that grew in the quiet, repetitive tasks of domesticity. It was this tension, the gap between her vast intellectual capacity and the narrow, practical roles assigned to women, that drove her toward organized political action. This culminated in the historic Women's Rights Convention of 1848. At the time, the public met the event with ridicule, but for Stanton, it was the moment she transitioned from a woman with private grievances to a leader of a public movement. As the decades passed, the memoir traces the evolution of her most famous partnership, her work with Susan B. Anthony. It's a relationship that functioned like two sides of a single coin. If Stanton was the philosopher, the rapid-fire writer, and the soaring rhetorician, Anthony was the strategist, the organizer, and the steady pragmatic force. They were a formidable team, but they were also a study in different approaches. The Civil War era brought a profound sense of betrayal to their work. As the nation moved to abolish slavery, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, but explicitly excluded women. This was a turning point. It forced the movement to make a choice. Do we focus on the immediate, achievable goal of the vote for black men, or do we continue the broader fight for universal suffrage? Stanton and Anthony chose the latter, launching a relentless, nationwide campaign that took them into the heart of the American West. The memoir describes these years as physically and emotionally grueling. There was the Kansas campaign, a massive 1,500-mile journey by carriage where they faced exhaustion, bad weather, and intense public hostility. They established a newspaper, The Revolution, to spread their message, but the struggle was constant. They weren't just fighting for the ballot, they were fighting for legal personhood. They began to challenge everything: marriage laws that gave men control over property, divorce laws that were heavily skewed against women, and even the restrictive bloomer dress reform, which sought to give women more practical clothing for movement and work. As the movement grew, so did the controversy surrounding Stanton's specific vision. While Anthony often focused on the singular political goal of the vote, a strategy of pragmatism, Stanton began to look at the root causes of inequality. She realized that even if women won the vote, they would still be subordinate as long as the religious and social structures of society remained unchanged. This is where the memoir takes its most radical, and, for many, its most polarizing turn. In her later years, Stanton turned her intellect towards theology. She argued that the Bible had been weaponized by men to justify the subordination of women, and that religious doctrine was the primary mechanism used to maintain gendered hierarchies. This led to her monumental and highly controversial project, the Woman's Bible. The backlash was intense. The clergy were outraged, and even within the suffrage movement there was a massive rift. Many leaders feared that Stanton's religious critiques would give opponents an easy weapon to discredit the entire movement. They wanted to stay focused on the political, but Stanton refused to separate the political from the spiritual. This tension eventually led to her being marginalized by the mainstream organizations she had helped build. She found herself at odds with the very movement she had spent her life fueling. Yet, despite this political isolation, Stanton remained a formidable presence. Her final years were marked by a continued refusal to be silenced. She traveled to England to engage with international reformers, proving that her influence had become a global phenomenon. She became an elder stateswoman, not just of the suffrage movement, but of the broader struggle for human autonomy. And looking back at the full arc of her life, the memoir reveals a woman who was never satisfied with half measures. She didn't just want women to have a voice in the polling booth, she wanted them to have agency over their bodies, their property, their marriages, and their souls. She spent her life dismantling what she called the tyranny of custom, those unwritten rules and social expectations that dictate how people should behave based on their sex. The ending of her journey is not a quiet retirement, but a reflection on a life of relentless, often lonely, intellectual combat. She leaves us with the image of a woman who understood that true liberation requires more than just changing laws. It requires changing the very way we understand our place in the world. She moved from the spirited, curious child in the Peterboro estate to a woman who stood at the intersection of politics and theology, challenging the most sacred institutions of her time. Her legacy is found in the tension between the political pragmatism of those who followed her path and the radical, systemic questioning that she pioneered. She didn't just want women to participate in the world as it was, she wanted to redefine what the world could be.